The situation in West Asia and particularly in Syria has taken every analyst by surprise, except the one who we have invited for our show today, Idrees Ahmad. He is the Director of Journalism at the University of Essex and also Associate Editor at New Lines magazine, and he writes for multiple foreign publications like Foreign Policy, The Observer, The Washington Post, The New York Review of Books, The Times Literary Supplement, and many others. He is currently writing a book on the war of narratives over Syria. Thanks, Mr. Idrees, for joining us today, and we would be very enlightened to have your views on the developments in Syria. So my first question to you is that what is your initial assessment about what is happening in Syria right now?
Well, it's a very fast-moving situation, and I think that you were a bit too kind to me in assuming that I was not one of those people who was surprised, because even the closest observers of this conflict, there was literally no one who could have predicted 2 weeks back that how things are going to unravel. Because it looked like pretty much a settled conflict. Assad had achieved his victory, and he had achieved it with the support of Russia and Iran and the various militias that they were able to mobilize. I think a few things happened over the past year, which really precipitated this collapse. One was obviously that HTS had been preparing for quite some time. But it always looked like some kind of a pipe dream, because the situation was just so, the rebels, even at the peak of it, had not been able to make the kind of gains that they've been able to do in the past 2 weeks. The second thing that happened is there was a time 10 years back when, more than 10 years back, this was in 2006 when Israel went to war against Lebanon. So at that time, Hezbollah was a very formidable military force, and Hezbollah basically defeated Israel at that time. And what happened over the past 13 years is that at Iran's insistence, Hezbollah intervened to support Assad in Syria. And because of that, it lost two very critical elements. One was its operational security, and the second was its organizational secrecy, and because it was infiltrated by various intelligence agencies. So Israel was very easily able to eliminate Hezbollah as a threat over the past year, and which created a situation where Assad's power, which had always been shored up by the Russian Air Force and by Hezbollah and Iran, all those three players were now occupied in their own concerns. And in fact, there was a lot of resentment in Hezbollah against Syria, that at the time when it was being completely destroyed by Israel, that Syria did nothing to intervene. So the Syrian regime's position was very brittle, and which was then proven, because as soon as Aleppo fell, it turned out that nobody was willing to fight for Assad, like among his own troops. So that's why it even took most of the rebels by surprise, that after Aleppo, they expected a prolonged fight, but that didn't happen. And they were able to advance first on Hama, and then they went on to Homs, and they expected prolonged fights. It didn't happen because the regime simply collapsed.
Okay, but was it so expected that HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group, is the only dominant force there? Have they been able to capture most of the Syria, or it is just closer to the capital from Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Hama, and then Damascus? But there are certain areas which are still not under their control. So how do you see that developing in quite some time from now?
Well, there's a big part of Syria which has been under SDF control. SDF is mainly a Kurdish-led coalition, which was essentially, it was put together by the US, because there was a Kurdish fighting force called YPG. And YPG is affiliated with PKK, which is proscribed by many Western countries as a terrorist organization, especially by Turkey. So because of that, the US rebranded the YPG as SDF, and also changed its composition a bit, so it wasn't exclusively Kurdish, but it did have Kurdish command. So they have a lot of, they had captured a lot of territory after the fight against ISIS, because supported by the West, they fought against ISIS, and they ended up capturing a lot of territory in the northeast, and basically east. So that part of Syria still remains outside of this new rebel coalition. And then there's also within the rebel groups, there's on one hand, HTS has support from various other groups like Ahrar al-Sham and others that who had fought previously for a decade over Assad, with Assad. But there's also a Turkish-backed faction called SNA. And SNA has got its own, not so much its own agenda, but most of the time it advances the Turkish agenda. And for Turkey, the big concern is to keep Kurds away from the border, and because they don't want the PKK to coalesce with or to have bases inside Syria. So they are using SNA as the instrument to advance their own foreign policy. And SNA's interests are not entirely aligned with HTS's. In fact, there have been quite a few points of major disagreement. So you will have, in the coming years, you will see that there are going to be there will be clashes within the opposition and within the anti-Assad opposition, which is quite broad. And also even within the HTS-led coalition, as even civil society is now catching up with the developments that they happen in such a rapid force. And they are concerned that they do not want, because the leader of the new transitional government just appeared for a speech with the Free Syria flag, but also with the Islamist flag. And so they are not keen to see the new government being dominated by Islamists, because Syria is a very country with a lot of diversities, many minorities. So there is concern that they do not want this new government to be Islamist-led.
Okay, like many analysts, Western analysts still believe that perhaps Syria will turn into Libya or Iraq after their dictators fell there. Do you still believe that? Because what I could make out of this entire protest was that it was largely people-backed, with lesser interference from foreign players as compared to what we saw in Iraq or what we saw in Libya, that US was largely involved there, there were forces on the ground. But do you think that Syria can go Libya and Iraq way, the way things are unfolding there?
I mean, there are reasons why, as you point out, that in this case, the liberation occurred mainly through Syrians' own steam. In fact, the foreign powers had tried to restrain them. Even Turkey, for many years, had tried to restrain the rebellion to the north because it didn't want any new trouble on its southern border. And then what happened is that as soon as the rebel advance started, so the US intervened diplomatically. So they tried to pressure Turkey to restrain the rebel groups. So the thing is that here, outside powers are actually entirely, it has taken them by surprise too, because this was achieved by Syrians themselves. So it's a very different scenario compared to what happened in Iraq. In Libya, although there was an indigenous uprising, but the thing was that because of the Western intervention and also because of the vacuum that was created later on, and that is still a threat, because in Libya, the UAE became a major player because it was backing this former Gaddafi general Haftar. And so what happened is that it created these rival governments inside Libya, and which led to this prolonged civil war. So here, obviously, we can't rule out the fact that outside players are going to try to exploit the situation, this vacuum. Israel is already doing that. Israel is trying to exploit that situation by, it has already tried to it has seized territory in the south, and it has also started bombing the thing it hadn't done over the past 13 years. When the Syrian regime only posed a threat to its own people, Israel was untroubled. But as soon as the opposition, the regime was overthrown, so now suddenly Israel is bombing Syria's military facilities, because they didn't see the regime as a threat, but they do see this new configuration emerging in Syria as a threat to its interests. So I doubt that it's going to be like Iraq, because one of the other things which has been a kind of a real good show of maturity by the Syrian rebels, even HTS, is that you have the big mistake that was done in Iraq was that after Saddam Hussein's fall, the Western occupiers, they tried to completely dismantle his state, including his army, including his bureaucracy and all. Effect of that was that this massive vacuum was created, and also this big disaffected population was created. Like the former soldiers who had nowhere else to go, the only choice that were left was to rise up to undermine the occupation. Here, even when Aleppo fell, so one of the things that HTS did was announce a complete amnesty for anybody who was laying down their arms. In fact, they were even told that they can retain their positions within the military or within the bureaucracy. So I think that's a very smart move, because if they hadn't done that, obviously these people then will have a good reason to then resist any new government coming in. So as long as they feel there's amnesty, as long as they feel a sense of security within the new configuration, so what's going to happen is that they don't really have a reason to risk all of that, to risk a future in this new Syria by needlessly taking up arms. So that has been a clever move, and that also, in a sense, preempts the Iraq type of a situation, especially because in Iraq, the dismantling of the Iraqi army was one of the trigger points for the rebellion, and also all the troubles that came out later on.
Okay, well, how do you see these entire development, where many theories are floating that the HTS chief, al-Julani, and he has got other names as well being quoted by the media, that he is backed by Israel because Israel is still occupying the land beyond Golan Heights, and yet there has been no response from the new regime. Do you buy this argument that he's being backed by US and Israel, just to dispel that rumor?
No, because I think that that also kind of a completely, there's a lot of historical amnesia that is involved in that, because when the US intervened in Syria in 2014, it's worth remembering that the US did not intervene to support the opposition. Even when there was a chemical attack, even when the US had drawn a red line, it didn't enforce it. In 2013, Assad used chemical weapons and it got away with it. The US didn't intervene, but it did intervene as part of its so-called war on terror in August 2014 in Iraq, and then in Syria later on, a month later. And when it intervened, so it jointly bombed not just ISIS, but also the anti-Assad rebels, especially the forerunner to HTS, which was the Jabhat al-Nusra. So it was extensively bombed. In fact, one of the very tragic incidents in 2017 had happened when the US bombed a mosque in Aleppo and killed like several hundred people, because it assumed that this was a gathering. It claimed that this was in fact, its initial claim was that this was a gathering of Jabhat al-Nusra, and later on turned out that it was just people who had gathered for the evening prayers. So the thing is that Jabhat al-Nusra for all these years has been extensively bombed. Israel obviously is never going to trust them, because the thing is that all of them are very supportive of the Palestinian cause. And but what Israel is doing right now is, in fact, it's going to do everything to undermine them, because that's one of the things, that they are putting them in a position that they either will have to confront Israel or to shrink from it. And if they shrink from it, that's completely then diminishes their, even right now, what's going to happen is that as they are seizing territory, so Jabhat al-Nusra is certainly not in a position to pick up a fight with a regional superpower, which is completely backed by the US, and which, it has been completely backed by Germany and the
I'll
UK.
just interrupt you there. You said that right now they're not in a position to retaliate. Doesn't mean that they don't want to, or they're just focusing on reconstruction of the country right now. Do you suggest that?
It's more like, because I think that they have a sense of, which battles to pick right now, because it has been 13 years that they have finally managed to, what they have done is that they have finally managed to, overthrow this very brutal entrenched regime for 53 years. So right now, they just don't have that capacity. I mean, they cannot go up against, so I doubt that anybody in HTS, I mean, generally, if you see the opinion among Syrians, so everybody has seen what Israel did in Gaza. That was very much what Assad was doing to them. So nobody has any sympathy for that. So what's going to happen is that these people, they have a very good sense of, in fact, also there's a lot of like fraternal relations between people. Like, in fact, right now, one of the things that happened was when Sadnaya was released, so a large number of Palestinians were released there from the Qassam brigade. So there were people from Hamas who were actually being held by the Syrian regime. So, which is kind of that's why these theories become ironic, because Assad was because he laid siege to the Yarmouk refugee camp for 5 years and inflicted the same thing that Israel is inflicting on Gazans. So there's no love for Israel, and certainly nobody is an instrument of Israel in this situation. In fact, if they had the capacity, they would have confronted Israel, but they don't. They are just recovering from a very brutal war for 13 years. And, and even there, the thing is that uh, a lot shifted. Like if the Russian Air Force was still there, it would still be a very bloody fight, because one of the things that even at the beginning, like 10 days back, what Russia was doing was, as soon as the rebels started advancing, it started bombing villages in Idlib, that they start bombing, the refugee camps and all. Because their whole method throughout was to demoralize the opposition at the front, because if their own homes were not safe in the back. So I don't think that, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of the kind of theories that come along, but there's absolutely nothing to that.
Idrees, just last question. There are many players in Middle East. You have got Russia, US, Iraq, Turkey. Many players were involved there. Who do you see standing to lose the most there? And while many other countries are still trying to establish contact with HTS or people in the new regime, do you think Russia is the bigger loser, or Iran is the bigger loser, and Turkey has gained the most?
I think certainly Iran has been the big loser, because Iran had invested a lot in trying to restore Assad's, or to shore up his power, and so they invested billions in that, and they invested a lot of manpower in that. They hired militias from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, and what happened then, Lebanon. So they hired them for nearly 13 years, so at great cost to themselves. So their whole strategic this outlook for the region now has to be revised, because they had this they created their own security, relied on creating these satellites for their power, or also a buffer to serve as a buffer between any hostile powers. So that has certainly suffered. And I think one of the other things that has happened is that the West is not in any position to gain from this, because there is general resentment towards the West, because over the past 13 years, they made statements but did absolutely nothing tangible to protect or do anything to aid Syrian civilians. In fact, as soon as this HTS started achieving these victories, the first thing that European governments started doing is that they started ending their asylum policy. So they are now, talking about forcing the Syrian refugees back, because, well, the conflict is over and that kind of thing. In fact, this was already happening for quite some years, but they were doing it in a different way. They were normalizing with Assad, and they were trying to declare Syria as a post-conflict society, so they can then force people back to Syria. So there's a lot of, unhappiness about that as well. So the West has lost. The Iranians have definitely lost. And Turkey has gained to some extent, because, certainly Turkey also had that issue, because if you go to Turkey over the past 7 or so years, so there was a lot of like a local resentment about the fact that, well, there were nearly 4 million refugees in Turkey, but the West was, here there was all these claims about a refugee crisis and all that, but most of the refugees were always in Turkey and Lebanon. So the thing is that they bore the brunt, the kind of the greater kind of cost of the war in Syria. So in a sense, for them as well, it's a relief that people will be able to return. And obviously, Turkey also has its own strategic interests. So I think that these countries have gained. Israel is going to definitely try to exploit. It's already doing that. And we will see, because one of the problems we have seen over the past year is that people used to see Israel as a client of the West. In fact, the West very often acts now as a client of Israel, because whatever it does, whatever action it takes, then the Western governments have to come out and rationalize it to their own publics. I mean, the UK is doing it right now, and the US is doing it right now. So I think that is going to be like something to watch, that what Israel does and how the West responds. Will they do anything to restrain? If not, so then they are laying the grounds for even more conflict in the region.